Okay, welcome to Unit 2, Lecture 6, which will also be about the Great Depression, but will also be about the New Deal. So we're finally going to start moving forward again. All right. Today's lecture, we'll look at what the New Deal did. I'm sorry, what the Depression did to the country. Can you go lay down, please? I have to work now. What the Depression did to sort of the social fabric of the nation, and look at some events there, and then we'll get into the New Deal. So let me open up the PowerPoint here to work. Oh, this old slow computer. There we go. Let's see, where do we stop at? All right, so share. Window. All right, so we stopped off at the end of 1931. We're going to backtrack a few years and look at exactly what the Depression did to everyday Americans and the effect that it had on their lives. Eventually, at its worst, 25% of the U.S. workforce would be out of work. Okay, so nearly 1 in 4 of U.S. workers would be out of work. But even for those who still had jobs, wages were cut, hours cut. The threat of losing a job was always something that sort of hovered over one's head. Homes broke up. Millions of men simply hit the road trying to find work someplace else. Prostitution, both in terms of, in terms of incident and participants, went up. Racism, even by the standards of the 1920s and 30s, racism became particularly ugly. Even the most menial jobs, even the worst jobs, like collecting garbage, became prizes. And so blacks lost even, again, the worst jobs, street sweeping, collecting garbage. These are jobs that typically minorities did, and even those jobs became coveted. And so the effects on the Depression of minorities was even worse, as their jobs were now going towards white people. There are some positive, well, is positive the word I want to use here? There are some positive effects of the Depression. High school graduation rates increased. Many boys who would quit high school to get a job before they graduated, well, there are no more jobs, so might as well stick around and finish one's education. The divorce rate dropped pretty significantly. It's too expensive to get divorced. And the childbirth rate dropped. And whether that's a positive or a negative, I'll leave for someone else to judge. But it did drop off. Kids are expensive. Okay. I don't even have kids, and I know they're expensive. I have a nephew, and he has very expensive tastes. So the childbirth rate dropped off because, again, kids are expensive. So there are, I guess, positives. I really can't think of a better word. A couple of other, now what about relief? What about getting help? Because again, people are out of work, people are going hungry, et cetera, et cetera. Well, private charities were simply overwhelmed. Religious charities, even non-religious charities, were simply overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the problem. As far as the government goes, which is to say, as far as the president goes, Hoover opposed what he called handouts, and what we today would simply call unemployment. All right. That comes about much later. He opposed that. But he did do a few things he increased public works spending to $400 million, so things like building roads, building bridges, dams, federal buildings, things like that. Programs were set up to simply buy agricultural goods from farmers in order to help stabilize farm prices, mortgage relief, and basically giving money to banks to the tune of about $2 billion. And the idea here is that the banks would take that money and start pumping it back into circulation. Okay, the commercial paper market, making loans, those type of things. Instead, the banks simply took the money and put it in their vaults and refused to hand it out. The banks were using it basically to keep themselves open. And there's a certain amount of necessity in that. Clearly, a closed bank is worse because people lose their money. But the banks should have started pumping some of that money back into the economy, and they didn't. They just sat on it. Why is Hoover doing so little? Hoover has a tremendous fear of deficit spending. He is deathly afraid to spend what is needed in order to get the economy running again. Remember, throughout the 1920s, debt and deficit had been coming down throughout the 1920s. And Hoover just doesn't want it to go up again. So he really does very little to alleviate the depression. Things began to get ugly. Farmers began simply burning their crops. They figured it would cost them more money to bring their crops in and sell them, so they simply burned it. They dumped out milk on highways. In several states, state governments told the banks not to foreclose on farms. Just leave them alone. Because there were threats of violence. Basically, you would go to one of these farm auctions where the family farm was being auctioned off, and a whole bunch of other farmers would show up with shotguns to make sure that the bidding didn't get too high. And in some instances, farms were bought for $1 by the men with the shotguns, and then the farms were immediately given back to the families who were being foreclosed on. So again, things are getting bad. Those of you who are familiar with 1301, that story I told you about the farmers sounds a little bit like Shays' Rebellion back in 1787. Sounds a little bit like the Whiskey Rebellion as well, back in 1794. So things are getting pretty ugly, and they're going to get uglier. For a lot of farmers, they now have to deal with the Dust Bowl. In the late 20s and 30s, large dust storms, because of a drought, began picking up topsoil and depositing it elsewhere. You could die in these storms. There was so much dust in the air that dead cattle, dead horses were not uncommon to find. One of my neighbors is mowing, and you could die if you got caught out in one of these things. A lot of farmers decided to pack up and head for California. This is something that if you've seen or read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, these people who were known as Okies simply selling off their stuff and heading out west looking for work. There's a wonderful song about this. An old Merle Haggard song, California Cotton Fields. I can't play it on here because YouTube will yank the video down for copyright, but I encourage you to look up that song and listen to it. Many of them making their way across the country and eventually staying in squalor, building these shacks out of essentially garbage and living in them. Once they got out to California, they found work picking fruit until fruit season picking was over, at which point they were forced to move on, often at gunpoint by local sheriffs. These sort of shack camps that we see here became known as Hoovervilles. There's also what's called a Hoover sandwich, which is 2 pieces of bread with nothing in between them. There's a Hoover flag. A Hoover flag is where you turn your pockets inside out to show that you don't have anything, you don't have any money in them. And so the pocket hanging out is called a Hoover flag. So lots of names being attached to Herbert Hoover. Disease is rampant in these camps. Typhoid, pellagra, which is a disease caused by malnutrition, cholera. John Steinbeck wrote about these conditions. It don't think I have. Let me see here real quick. What's called the Harvest Gypsies, which were a number of articles, 7 of them, that John Steinbeck wrote about the conditions that people were living in these camps. If I can spell harvest, there we go. Again, this is by John Steinbeck. And it should be in the public domain. If not, you can find many, many excerpts of it online. But he talked about the living conditions, he talked about the health conditions, the squatters living next to irrigation ditches, sanitary conditions, all these type of stuff. One section talks about how hard it is to get a doctor to come out to see your sick children. But if your child dies, the doctor will come out immediately because there's paperwork that has to be filed. But getting a doctor for a sick patient is next to impossible. Steinbeck talks about one father who had buried 3 of his children in less than 2 weeks, dying in these camps. So again, there's a lot of anger. This is the worst crisis the nation has faced since the Civil War. Some veterans attempted to get their bonuses. And we need to talk now about the bonus march. During World War I, Congress had voted to give a bonus to all World War I veterans. That bonus would be given in 1945. Veterans decided they would rather have the bonus in 1931 rather than wait till 1945. And so what is called the bonus march or the bonus expedition or the bonus expeditionary army began popping up throughout the country, heading for Washington, D.C. Here we see soldiers, World War I veterans, on their way from Jeannette, Pennsylvania, going to Washington, D.C. Once in Washington, D.C., they set up a camp, Hooverville, maintained order. Okay. There was a committee that ran the camp. Garbage was picked up. A basic level of sanitation was enforced. The communists were driven out. Okay. These are regular veterans, not communists coming to overthrow the government. Hard times are still hoovering over us. The House of Representatives approved early payment. The Senate said no. Most of the marchers went home, but some of them stayed. And the longer they stayed, the more there was a fear that revolution was going to break out in Washington, D.C. We're up at about summer of 1932. So you have all these veterans from the war who are camped out at the Washington Monument. Yep, summertime in Washington. It's humid, but you know, might as well just hang out there and see what happens. Fear begins to grow that a revolution is going to break out. And so eventually, in July 1932, Hoover orders the army and police to clear out the camps. This also involved tear gassing World War I veterans and eventually setting their Hooverville on fire. And this is done 4 months before presidential election. Hoover clearly lost the presidential election of 1932. Basically spent several years attempting to sabotage his successor's plans, the New Deal. Then sort of drifted into an elder statesman kind of role, but a lot of people never forgave Herbert Hoover. Not only for this bonus march thing, but also for just the entire ineffectual method of trying to deal with the Depression. The resentment by a lot of people never went away, particularly in my grandparents' generation. Well, the new president is Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose own personal story of overcoming polio, whose own sunny outlook. You know, his theme song for running for president was a song called Sunny Days Are Here Again. The fact that he had overcome you know, a devastating illness like polio. You know, America loves a comeback story. America loves to root for the underdog. And so by coming back from polio, becoming governor of New York, and by basically promising to do something, okay? Hoover's problem is he did as little as possible. Roosevelt promises to at least try to alleviate the Depression. Okay, some of Roosevelt's programs are going to fail. Some of them will be ruled unconstitutional. But at least he's going to try and do something. He also promised to end prohibition as well. There are basically 3 New Deals when we talk about the New Deal, right? There's the first New Deal, which we're going to look at right now. There's a second New Deal, which is about 1935-36, and then there's a third New Deal. And we're really not going to do much with the third New Deal because it's primarily just sort of easing back on New Deal programs, and then when the economy falters, pushing the gas back down on New Deal programs is basically the third New Deal. But let's talk about the first New Deal. Okay. Relief, recovery, reform. Okay. So immediate relief, long-term recovery, reform. Let's try to make sure this doesn't happen again. All right, so let's start with relief. Okay, let's get people back to work as quickly as we possibly can. Okay. Bunch of new programs that have come out of this. All right, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, okay. Men, 18 to 35, $30 a month. What are they doing? They're working in parks, much of the national park, a lot of the roads in the national park, a lot of the buildings in the national park, at least the older ones built by the CCC. Conservation projects, work in national forests, those type of things. This is going to go on from 1933 to 1942. Every single state, all the territories, okay, they live in camps, they wear uniforms, there's discipline. How bad has the Depression been? When you joined the CCC, you had to undergo a medical inspection. 70% of the men joining the CCC showed the effects of malnourishment. Okay. That is how bad things have been for the last 4 years. Okay. And these are men ages 18 to 35 who are showing signs of malnourishment. Very few of them had any work experience because for a lot of them, they come out of high school immediately into the Depression, no work. There is a black version, which is segregated, but does get paid the same amount of money. There is also a similar program for Native Americans. Okay, so again, this is about putting money back into people's hands and getting, because they'll spend that money. They'll send that money back home to their parents, and their parents will use that money to start pumping the economy again. Okay, even if it's just things like buying groceries. Okay, that's going to help out farmers. Okay, getting nourishment back into your body, those type of things. Okay, if you have a little spending money, that's going to pump that economy a little bit more. Okay, but that is about getting money right back into the hands of Americans as quickly as possible. It never becomes it's probably the most popular program from the entire relief. There's not a lot of polling in the 1930s, but there is one poll in 1936 in which 82% of respondents had a positive opinion of the CCC, and that even included 67% of Republicans. If you're wondering why it ends in 1942, because when we go to war, we have another 18 to 35-year-olds can just join, the military. But the CCC doesn't continue after 1942, but there is, for conscientious objectors to the war, the spirit of the CCC kind of lives on for people who were opposed to the war, Quakers, and other religious groups who didn't want to participate in World War II. There was something, the spirit of the CCC found work for them to do. The CWA, Civil Works Administration. This is a very temporary program. It's only the winter of 1933, 1934. It pumps about 400 million into relief. For people who can't join the CCC because of age or perhaps medical reasons, let's put them back to work, okay? Let's get money back in their pockets so that they can start pumping the economy. So this is stuff like, you know, picking up garbage, beautification projects, installing playground equipment, trimming trees down at the local park, just stuff like that, just to get people through that winter of 33, 34, make sure they're fed, make sure they can heat their houses, make sure they can buy clothes for their family, okay? So not a permanent program. Again, it's only there for a little bit. Banking. Banking kind of falls under relief and reform. First up, the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Give me just a second. I need to extend time in here. I wasn't sure how long I set this particular lecture up for. Give me just a minute. Yeah, let me make sure we don't run out of time. Okay. Banking. Roosevelt had a lot of people to the left of him encouraging him to use the federal government to take over the banks. Roosevelt didn't want to do that, okay? He wanted to save the banking system, not take it over. All right, so how does this work? March 9th, every single bank in the United States closes, shuts their doors. During that time period, for 4 days, the Treasury Department comes in and inspects these banks, okay, inspects their books. How much money do they have? What are their obligations? How much have they loaned out? How much are they getting back? All that kind of stuff. Banks that are deemed safe are allowed to reopen on March 13th. Okay. And that basically about 2/3 of the nation's banks are reopened after being inspected by the Treasury Department. Okay. So that's about 5,000 banks that are allowed to reopen. The other banks are basically either absorbed by good banks, or they're simply taken over by the Treasury Department to be reorganized. And the thing is, those banks that are allowed to reopen are deemed safe. Okay, they have been inspected by the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Department has said these banks are safe. It is safe to put your money in these banks. And so what we begin to see is that people do start putting their money back into banks. Deposits start going back up. Now, that's relief. We need reform of the banking system. And that's where we get the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. The Glass-Steagall Act does two things. First of all, it establishes the FDIC. Okay? And the FDIC provides deposit insurance for member banks. So basically, if your money is in a bank and that bank collapses, the federal government pays back your money. Okay. It's initially at $5,000, I believe. It is now $250,000. Okay. So you got your money in the bank fails. As long as your bank is FDIC member, federal government will cut you a check for your losses. The other thing Glass-Steagall does is it separates banks into two types of banks: commercial and investment. Okay. And it establishes a wall between them. Let me explain to you. A commercial bank is what most of us think of as a bank. You deposit your money, they give you a nice card and a book of checks, take money out, put money in, they make loans so you can buy houses and cars. Most of us, when we think of a bank, we are thinking of a commercial bank. Okay? An investment bank is a whole nother beast. You put your money into an investment bank, and it usually requires $100,000 as a minimum deposit, and they invest it in stocks and bonds. Now, investment banks have no FDIC protection. If you give your money to an investment bank and they lose your money, tough. Your money is gone. Okay? A commercial bank has the FDIC protection, as do most credit unions. But investment bank, you lose your money, sorry, federal government's not going to cut you a check because your bank lost your money. And it basically says that a commercial bank can't invest in stocks and other securities. Okay. Can't do that. And Glass-Steagall existed until the 1990s, when one piece of human garbage named Phil Gramm wrote legislation that killed Glass-Steagall, and another piece of human excrement named Bill Clinton signed the damn thing into law. And we saw the results of that in 2007, 2008, when banks began collapsing again, because banks, commercial banks, your regular neighborhood bank, was no longer prohibited from investing in securities thanks to Phil Gramm and Bill Clinton and several other people who I don't have enough time to run down all their names. So we saw very few bank closures. Let me get you a graph here. I'll get this graph right from the FDIC. Insert picture from old slow computer. Woo-wee! Remember 2008, 2009, 2010? A little bump here, but for the most part, bank failures are pretty stable in the 21st century until the housing market collapsed and we found out that our banks have been sticking money into unsafe investments. Yeah. And now we've sort of gotten them back under control. Bank closure graph. Let me find. Trying to find one from the 20th century. And all I'm finding are stock crashes. There should be a graph here. Where's the one? Here we go. So again, after emergency banking, we weed out. That's what this is, this weeding out of banks. All those banks that weren't allowed to reopen after the Emergency Banking Relief Act, that's what this is. And then the number just drops off to nothing. Okay. And there hasn't been an attempt in Congress to put Glass-Steagall back into place. Most notably, Elizabeth Warren has been pushing for that. Now, we haven't helped out the farmers yet, so let's help out the farmers. Agricultural. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. In which we paid farmers to make less stuff. Right? Stop growing so much stuff, because if there's fewer apples, guess what happens to the price of apples? Price of apples will go up. Okay? If there's fewer pigs, price of bacon will go back up. Okay? And obviously prices can sometimes go up due to transportation problems, inflation, et cetera, but I'm keeping this real basic here. We simply paid farmers and livestock people to do less work. And that would raise prices and put some money back into their damn pockets. And that's basically what happened. Prices came, commodities came down, prices went up. Now, the Supreme Court struck this down in 1936, but it's going to come back in 1938 as part of the third New Deal. And it still sticks around today. We're still paying I don't mind paying family farms some money to help stabilize, but these giant agro corporations, maybe not, okay? There's an older report about this called Moscow on the Mississippi, about how much money we're paying out to basically large corporations to not grow more crops. This is an older report, but it's still ongoing. And again, I don't mind paying family farms. I mean, I had farmers in my family. That's fine, giving them a lift here and there. But, you know, Ted Turner, we were paying Ted Turner $1 million a year not to grow crops. Seriously. All right, AAA, and finally, the WPA, also known as the Works Progress Administration. 1935 to 1943. What are we talking about here? We're talking about construction. A lot of older, particularly in the South, older post offices were built by the WPA in some of these real tiny towns, if you're ever driving around in Texas. Roads, dams, things like that. But it also provided jobs for people in the arts. So, I mean, they would hire like orchestras and send them on tour across the United States. They would hire troops of actors and send them out on tour to the United States to really, really out of the way places. So you might live in a town that maybe only has a couple thousand people, and the biggest place to do anything is in the cafeteria at the local school. Well, guess what? Here comes the orchestra, and they're playing in that cafeteria. And the Shakespearean people are going to do Hamlet in that cafeteria if it kills them. All right. So it puts a lot of creative types back to work. It spent roughly $11 billion during its lifetime before ending in 1943. Some of its programs were most notably, those of you who have ever used the Texas Handbook, that was a WPA program. Basically, researchers, historians, writers, scientists were hired by many states to basically create handbooks for their states. And this was funded by the Works Progress Administration. Texas decided to keep going even after the WPA ended. And so if you've ever used the Texas Handbook, which is now online, that has its roots in the Works Progress Administration. Again, the state of Texas took it over after 1943 and has kept it going. The last time they printed the Texas Handbook was in 1999, and it was 6 volumes, and I mean volumes. And of course, since then, it's just gone to online. That makes more sense. So a lot of these types of programs, again, putting researchers, scientists, historians, artistic types, creative types back to work as part of the WPA. The WPA also banned child labor. It also banned convict labor as well. You could not use convicts, what was called the penal system. Penal system, not penile system. It came in for some criticism. Some of the projects seem to move at a snail's pace, leading to the nickname "We Piddle Along." We putter around. That was another favorite name. And there probably was some of that. There probably was an incentive to work as slowly as possible so that the jobs would stick around. I'm not going to argue that that didn't happen, because clearly it did. But the WPA, for the most part, provided jobs, put people back to work, and built some really amazing projects here in the nation. So that's the first New Deal. Now, there were critics of the New Deal. Let's look at them. Most of the criticisms felt that Roosevelt had not gone far enough to the left. And the foremost critic on that idea was Governor Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana. Long was proposing what he called a share the wealth program, which went much further to the left than even Roosevelt was willing to. It involved confiscating fortunes over a set dollar amount. I don't know what the dollar amount was, but if you had more than, we'll just say $100,000. If you had more than $100,000, well, everything over $100,000 was going to be confiscated by the government to help the less fortunate. Free college, fewer work hours, and more help for labor unions. And labor unions were one group that had gotten left out of the first New Deal. And so Governor Long picked up a lot of support for his ideas before being assassinated in 1935, before he could run for president. Dr. Francis Townsend pointed out that the elderly had been left out of the first New Deal. The first New Deal was about putting people back to work, or what if you were too old to work anymore. And so his idea was a pension plan that would pay the elderly monthly to basically not work anymore. This would free up jobs for younger people and provide security for older people. And of course, what we're looking at here is Social Security. And then finally, Father Charles Coughlin, who was a priest who had a radio program and was very, very popular. And he initially had been for the New Deal, but it sort of faded away, and he sort of mixed in a mixture of ideas from the left and the right, the extremes of the left and the right. So he certainly calls for more protections for labor unions, which is what Huey Long had done. He's also in favor of wealth redistribution. Okay, same thing Huey Long had been in favor of. Nationalization of industry. Basically, the government should take over steel, coal, railroads, telephone, telegraph, stuff like that. Then after 1936, he started pulling from the far right. he starts talking a whole lot about Mussolini and Hitler. He has a lot of ideas about Jews. His newspaper, basically, he had a newspaper called Social Justice, which started reprinting Hitler's speeches in full. Again, he has a lot of ideas about what to do with Jews and atheists. He started giving the Nazi salute when he was in public. He very much was in favor of what in Germany was called Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, in which Jews in Germany were attacked and murdered. He eventually began associating with a group which called itself the Christian Front. And their plan was to start murdering members of Congress in order to set up a dictatorship. Now, Coughlin was never implicated with planning anything, but he did not disassociate himself from their ideas. Okay? So even after it came out that these guys wanted to start killing congressmen and Jews and atheists, and he didn't disassociate himself with these people. His reputation suffered a serious setback. His bishop and archbishop yanked his ass off the air, although he was continued to serve as a priest for the rest of his life until he died, I think in 1932. Charles Coughlin, 1979. So yeah, even after he was yanked off the air, he was still allowed to serve as a priest until 1966. And continued afterwards. I don't know what priests do when they retire. I guess they're sort of elder statesmen, or I don't know. But some of his ideas are going to influence the Second New Deal. Right? So again, Huey Long feeling labor, what about the elderly? What about industry? So let's look at the Second New Deal, because a lot of those ideas that these guys had flow into the Second New Deal. The most obvious one is Social Security. Social Security, Dr. Townsend's idea, providing a pension for the elderly so that they will retire, open up new jobs for young people, and also have some security. Initially, it was only meant for retirement, but it now deals with unemployment, disability, survivorship, etc. Now, there's a lot of jokes about Social Security. The first woman to get a Social Security check had only put $24 into the system. Her first check was for $22. She lived to be 100 and collected $22,000, even though she only put $24 in. Okay, haha. There's plenty of people who pay into Social Security who never get to use it. My mother paid into Social Security from the age of 18 until shortly before she died, and she died before she retired. So there hopefully is a balance, at least until Congress started raiding it in the 1980s and just left an IOU in there, which, yeah, I'm not counting on it being there when I retire, and you probably shouldn't either. All right, Social Security. The Wagner Act provided a right for labor to form a union. Okay, I'm talking about Huey Long and Charles Coughlin. And both felt that labor had been forgotten. So this allows labor to form unions. And then there were a few other odds and ends. Rural Electrification Act. Electricity had still not come to every part of America. A number of electric companies had basically decided it would not be cost effective to provide electricity to people living out in the very rural areas of the country. Again, you have to put the poles in, you have to string the wire, you have to put the breaker boxes in people's houses. That's a lot of money, and a number of electric companies had simply decided that was not going to be worth it, and so the federal government stepped in, so we can see here, to provide electricity and later phone lines to people living in rural America. Now, the electricity isn't free, and neither is the phone service, but at least the hardware, the infrastructure, that's a debate we're having a lot of lately, is there in place for people to use if they want to use it. And then, let me see here, the study guide. The Tennessee Valley Authority even by Depression standards, the Tennessee Valley was in really bad shape. Let me move this slide up here. This is the Tennessee Valley, covering all of Tennessee, parts of Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and a good chunk of Mississippi. And by Depression standards, this place was in bad shape. 30% of the population had malaria. Some families only made $100 per year. And much of the crop, much of the soil had been eroded by over farming. And so the TVA brought a whole bunch of stuff to the Tennessee Valley. It brought medical care. It brought electricity. It brought soil science. Okay, coming in here and teaching these farmers about how to use nutrients. As you can see here in this dramatic picture, showing two halves of the same field. One half, the food is barely growing. The other half, where they've used modern fertilizers, food is growing again. It brought in electricity through the building of these dams in the Tennessee Valley to provide hydroelectricity. It brought jobs to build all this stuff. As we can see here, this group of men on the job site, and ultimately bringing electricity to these people as well. And you can see here this map showing areas of dams, hydroelectricity dams, and also other important projects by the TVA. So yeah, the TVA really dragged the Tennessee Valley into the 20th century. This is a part of the nation that really had not recovered from the Civil War in many ways. and brought a lot of stuff to these people, and provided a lot of jobs, a lot of really good jobs for these people, and really improved this area. And it's still, the federal government still has a lot of oversight over the Tennessee Valley Authority. Well, what are the results here? Wages and salaries, we can see here on this graph, start to go back up again. This is this downward trend here. That's what's called the recession of 37. Basically what happened here, and this really isn't important for your test, but Roosevelt sort of dialed it back on the New Deal, and so that actually caused a recession. And so here you see putting the gas back on the New Deal, where it goes back up again. Business failures, again, sort of leveling off, then another dropping off, but then after 1937, going back up, and then in 1941. What happens here in 1941? Oh wait, I was reading this chart wrong. So business failures going down, okay, leveling off, dropping down again, going back up. There's that recession of 1937, and then starting to level back off again. Farm prices, we talked about farming. So here you can see the farmers start building back up, building back up. There's that recession of 37, and then swinging back up again. Bank failures pretty much zero out after 1934. Unemployment peaking here in 1933, dropping off. Again, the 1937 recession, employment going back up, but then dropping off again. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression. Okay. Did not end the Great Depression. Okay. In fact, by 1940, unemployment was still sitting at 14%. Okay. Still double-digit unemployment. By 1943, unemployment was sitting at 2%. The Great Depression was ended by World War II, either by people going into the armed forces or by people getting jobs in defense industry. It did help. The New Deal did not end the Depression, but it certainly did help alleviate some of the problems. It stabilized the banking system. Bank failures were a normal part of American society until New Deal legislation took care of that until 2007. Regulation of the stock market has been sort of hit or miss, but there's not a stock market crash again until 1987. There are times when the stock market struggles, but it doesn't crash again for a long time. In 1937, The Economist, which is a magazine not known for being terribly friendly to economic ideas on the left, published an appraisal of the New Deal. I'm going to get the whole quote for you. Give me just a second. Come on, computer. Come on. Scroll on down here. Copy. Here. Paste. Select all. Let's drop this down to about 36. If the criterion be utopian, the achievements of the New Deal appear to be small. Relief there has been, but little more than enough to keep the population fed, clothed, and warm. Recovery there has been, but only to a point well below pre-depression level. The great problems of the country are hardly still touched. There has been no permanent readjustment of agriculture. Very little has been done to iron out fluctuations of industrial production. The monetary structure of the country is less under control. However, if the New Deal be compared not with the absolute standards of utopia, but with the achievements of other governments, the former adverse judgment must be modified. If it be compared with either the performance or the promise of its rivals, it comes out well. If its achievements be compared with the situation which confronted it in March 1933, it is a striking success. So again, the New Deal does not solve the Depression, but it certainly helps move the country in the right direction. And many of its programs, particularly Glass-Steagall and the attempts to regulate banking and stocks, those effects will be felt much further on throughout the rest of the 20th century. But again, looking at these unemployment numbers, it's not going to be until 1943 that the Depression probably can officially be reckoned as over, and that's only because of the war. Would the economy have recovered without World War II? Yes. It would have taken much longer. It certainly would have looked different, but I do think, and a number of economic historians agree, that the economy eventually would have recovered at some point, although it may have taken, another decade or more to get there. All right. So that's it for the New Deal. We'll come back next time. We will be looking at post-war foreign policy, the foreign policy of the 1920s and 1930s. It's pretty short because there's not a lot of foreign policy. And then after that, we'll start making our way towards the Second World War. All righty. And that is it for this afternoon. And I will see you in the next